John Wheat and Jack Jackson are one heck of a team. Jack has another work already done on a person who, and it should appear within a year or two from a major university press. That's all I can say right now, but it's a biography of a very little known borderlands Texan by the name of Pedro Elias Bean, or Peter Ellis Bean, who was the Mexican commandant in East Texas in the years just before the revolution. Very important figure, and Jack's biography is certainly going to do justice to him. John Wheat has a secret project underway that he has forbidden me to say anything about, but I'm very excited about it. He also has, along with Frank de la Teja, an article in the forthcoming, the April quarterly of the Texas State Historical Association, the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, on a frontier, it's a translated document on the frontier forces of New Spain in northern New Spain, including this place, in 1804. As I said, Almonte had to think a lot about Texas and Mexico and the United States. He probably knew the three areas, Texas, the rest of Mexico, and the United States, as well as anyone who was important at that time. John and Jack are going to tell us about the coming of the Texas Revolution as seen by the Mexican government, specifically their point man, Juan Nepomuceno Almonte.
That's mine. Thank you very much, Jim. First off, I want to complain. No, this is a little correction. I noticed that in your information packets that everyone has, you're asked to participate in an exercise of trying to recognize all the figures in the famous Huddle painting of the surrender of Santa Anna on the battlefield at San Jacinto. And there's a key on the back. There are numbers above each figure, and there's a key on the back. You're supposed to try to fill in the appropriate number opposite the name. Well, I looked on the back and searched in vain for our man Almonte. Instead, he appears as Belmonte. So I would just like to make that correction before we get underway. So we're not talking about Juan Nepomuceno Belmonte today, but Almonte. Thank you very much. Okay. I would like to continue in the same vein that Greg Cantrell started this afternoon, and that is talking about the mindset, the development of the mindset, in this case of the Mexican government as the legitimate interested parties in affairs in Texas, this being part of Mexico, and sometimes this fact almost seems to be forgotten when you get into the latter stages of what turned into the Texas Revolution, was that somehow the Mexican authorities, by showing up, were somehow invading or interloping in Texas affairs when actually it was part of Mexico and it was entirely their business to do so. But anyway, I would like to first start by telling a little biographical background. Jack Jackson and I were asked to write what I call sort of touchy-feely personal bios for the upcoming next edition of Riding Line, a quarterly publication of the Texas State Historical Association. And they like to feature in each issue some personal biographical material from their writers that have books published by the association. We have a book published by the association, so Jack and I contributed our little pieces about how we came to write about this era of Texas history and about Almonte in particular and how we got into this. Now, I was the translator on the book, and so I talk about why I'm the translator for this particular book. And I go all the way back to my interest in Mexico. Actually, my father, being a historian of Mexico, Raymond Wheat, he was a student of Carlos Castañeda, by the way, at the University of Texas. And he wrote his dissertation on the era of reform, Benito Juarez era in 1857. He took the family to Mexico City when I was just 12 years old. And I recount how I walked the streets of Mexico City and tread those ancient cobblestones where Moctezuma and Cortez had trod. You see how touchy-feely this got for the publication. And then I add as an aside, I learned later from my mother doing an oral history one Thanksgiving that I was conceived in Mexico City. And not only that, I think I know the hotel. So I have this very personal connection with Mexico since early on. And this is what's led me into my interest in Spanish. My father was a Spanish teacher, and Mexican history, and by extension, Latin American history. And all of this has led me down this rocky, nefarious path that it's called being a translator of historical works, and has led me into 2 collaborations with Jack Jackson. Okay, that said, I think I found it fascinating, therefore, to get into the mindset, to understand this character, Juan Nepomuceno Almonte, as he comes to grips with the situation in Texas and is sent by the Mexican government to come assess the situation and make a report to the government on the situation and what we should do about it to conserve Texas. And that operative phrase throughout this whole episode, these 2 years that we'll be looking at, to preserve the integrity of our national territory. That phrase crops up in just about every other letter he writes. First of all, I thought it would be instructive also to give you a little visual relief from talking heads at the podium, to put a little couple of slide things on. I'm told to do this to turn it on, and this. It works. Okay. This is Juan Nepomuceno Almonte as a young man in his 20s, probably in the 1820s. Let me just give you a brief biographical background on the road to San Jacinto, we might call it. Almonte was born in 1803. Of course, ironically, that is the year of the Louisiana Purchase, which brings the expanding United States to the very doorstep of then Spanish Texas. He's not only the son of one of Mexico's greatest national heroes, José María Morelos, he's also the illegitimate son of José María Morelos, who of course was a Spanish priest. His mother was an Indian, and therefore he is, as you can see fairly well here, a mestizo Mexican. And therefore in his diplomatic representations, he was a mestizo representative of a largely mestizo nation of Mexico. And I think this plays an important role in his attitudes and his dealings with Anglo-Americans later in his life, with rather virulent racism and other attitudes that he found as they looked at him. This slide, you can still see, has a pretty impressive afro for the day. I'm going to push ahead to the next slide and hold this next one for a while, because this is the later Almonte. It's the same guy, believe it or not. Different hairdo, but in the official uniform of the Mexican military service, probably taken this is a photograph now, taken rather late in his life, sometime before the French intervention. Here's something else I have to point out. Almonte, of course, was vilified by the proponents of Texas independence and the revolution here. And he's also vilified by Mexican historians today for his role later in his life in the French intervention, supporting the monarchist and the Maximilian imperial rule of Mexico during the time of our own Civil War, and therefore an enemy of Benito Juarez, one of the greatest beloved heroes in Mexico. So he's looked down upon by Mexican historians and called a traitor since back in the 1860s, and looked down upon and called a vile spy and traitor by Texans here. So he's not a really popular guy. He's sort of an interesting character to take on. Anyway, Almonte, as the son of Morelos, was actively involved from childhood in the events of Mexico's independence. He actually went out on the battlefield as a boy with his father and would help with other boys to help pick up spent Spanish cannonballs and recover them and use them to be fired back at the Spanish enemy. He was later, while still as just a stripling, I should say, was given the rank of general, and the Congress approved it because his father was Morelos, of course. When things got sticky in the long 11-year war for Mexican independence, Morelos sent his illegitimate son to New Orleans, first for exile and safety, second for education, where he learned his English, which was impeccable by the time he gets to Texas, and thirdly, makes all sorts of contacts in the business and political worlds in New Orleans, and gets to know the United States and North America in general, becomes an expert in dealing with them. After Texas or Mexican independence, during the time of Governor Felix Tres Palacios under Iturbide, 1822, Almonte is in Texas and trying to get supplies in New Orleans for the government of Felix Tres Palacios. So he already has a sort of a Texas experience as he's gaining experience in politics and military. After 1822, he ends up in diplomatic service in London, representing the Mexican Republic, and that's about the time that that earlier portrait was painted. So here's someone in his 20s, a very, very young diplomat. He already has diplomatic expertise representing Mexico. And on and on through the 1820s, he gains all this government experience and rises up through the ranks. By 1834, at the time that he's ready to undertake his mission to Texas, there had already been a significant series of events leading up to the concerns that he was to address. In 1828, Jim Crisp has already mentioned the inspection visit by General Mieri Terán, who spent a good part of a year up here with Berlandier and all these other guys, ostensibly to delineate the actual boundary between Louisiana and Mexican Texas, but also to assess the situation, take observations, assess the situation, and give a report to the Mexican government on the situation there. One of the things that Terán reported back was, we have an illegal alien problem on our border. Undocumented foreigners are coming across the river and settling in our territory. You know, of course, they were Anglos and not the kind that we hear about these days. But there was this, and of course, many of them were on the lam from the law or had other problems that they brought in with them. But he was already outlining this great problem happening in the northeastern part of Texas in 1828. And this immediately led to his recommendation. He was largely responsible for the passing of the law of April 6, 1830, to which reference has already been made, to stop the introduction of slaves and to stop the introduction of North American colonists. And has already also been pointed out, this law was effectively ignored and gotten around, such that it was eventually repealed by the time that Almonte was heading up to Texas. It was inoperative. So that was part of the legacy of Mieri Terán that he inherited just 6 years later. In 1832, of course, Santa Anna has assumed the presidency and assumed dictatorial powers and become a heavy centralist and has set about to suppress all sorts of regional opposition around Mexico, not just in Texas, but all over the place. But in Texas, of course, we've already had armed conflicts in places such as Velasco and Anahuac. Of course, the Mexicans would say Anahuac, because that's an ancient Aztec name for the Valley of Mexico. But anyway, I won't fight that battle. Also, and then by 1833, we have this increased agitation for separate statehood of Texas to be unleashed from its union with Coahuila. And in Mexico, again, talking about mindset and attitude, in Mexico, this agitation for separate statehood is tantamount to one stage on the road to dissolution and separation from Mexico, independence from Mexico. That's the way the Mexicans saw the agitation for statehood. They said it was far too premature, you didn't have sufficient population, and not only that, the situation is such that we think this is going to lead to an eventual taking away of Mexico. So they were staunchly opposed to the statehood issue, and of course, Austin's agitation and representation of that got him in hot water and eventually caused him to be arrested and imprisoned in Mexico. And that's where he is in solitary confinement in Mexico when Almonte is getting ready to undertake his mission. So that's one of the issues that Almonte has to deal with coming to Texas, is the imprisonment of Stephen F. Austin and attitudes of the colonists toward that imprisonment. One of the other great problems that he was facing, of course, and this map, I think, will be highly instructive. That is the famous David H. Burr map of 1833. So this is right on the eve of his undertaking his mission. This map was cited specifically by Almonte as Jack Jackson refers to it as the smoking gun evidence that look how much Texas has been given over to the hands of foreign impresarios and land speculators. Every inch of land, at least that where settlement is in the name of some foreign landholder, except maybe Martín de León. This was, to him, a tremendous problem that Mexico had gotten itself into. They had given away, we've already heard the details of it, large parcels of land for free to anybody that would come in and settle it and work it. Of course, the mindset was, why did the Mexicans do this? Well, they wanted population. They wanted an economy, a functioning economy. And the Anglo settlers supposedly offered this. But a lot of the settlement patterns were now getting out of hand. People were coming in without documentation. Land was being freely traded and speculated. People were making lots of money, and impresario contracts were not being fulfilled. All sorts of problems going on up here, and Almonte then undertakes his mission in 1834 under the ostensible title of Director of Colonization. That's the cover story for what he's doing up there. He's overseeing and trying to put more order and system back into the allocation of land to impresarios and to incoming colonists, and trying to put some sense of order in the state government at Saltillo, where they also found, the Mexican central government found many problems there as well. There was a great deal of conflict between the central government in Mexico and the government in Saltillo, in Coahuila. And so there was that was part of the problem, is the way the government in Mexico saw it. I want to show you one other thing just very quickly. This is just an oddity, a historical oddity. General Almonte's cigars. He never had a mustache like that, but the name stuck. In other words, this is not an unknown, obscure historical figure. This name stuck in the mind of 19th and even early 20th century America. This, for example, if you can see at the bottom, the Haley and Lang Company, Sioux City, Iowa, Fort Dodge, Iowa, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I did a little searching on the internet to find out about this company, and it was a company involved in the distribution of agricultural products, and I'm assuming cigars as well, in that region, in an industrial guide from about 1909. So this guy, of course, with this sort of fanciful portrait of him, still lives on in cigar box lore. And there's even a town near Ottawa in Canada called Almont, with an E on the end of it, and that was actually named for Almonte as well. In this case, it was founded back in the mid-19th century and named for him because he was a hero of resistance against North American expansionism. Imagine the Canadians being concerned about that. Yeah. So Almonte shows up in the oddest places, you know, aside from our history book that we have. Okay, that's all the slides I have. We can turn the lights up, probably. He comes to Texas and undertakes a tour of about 9 months duration, starting in February of 1834 and on to October of 1834 before he finally gets back to Mexico City. He's compiling information. He's writing some 50 letters to the Secretary of Foreign Relations and other officials, all the while he's traveling through Texas. His original plan was to come to sail from Veracruz, obviously to Galveston, and start his tour of Texas. But the situation was so uncertain, and there were so many threats that he might be arrested and held hostage in order to free Stephen F. Austin or something like this, that he changed his plans and said, I'm not sailing to Galveston, I'm going to go to New Orleans, a city that I know, where I have contacts, and I'm going to start investigating the situation from New Orleans. So that's what he did. And then he proceeded, after a couple of weeks, to Natchitoches, getting a little closer to the Texas border, finally. And finally, he felt it was safe to go into Texas itself, and he proceeds from there to Nacogdoches. After Nacogdoches, where he stays for a good while, he gets to all the major communities around Texas, San Felipe and Goliad, or La Bahia, and Bejar, of course. So he gets around. He talks to all of the people there. He talks to Mexican officials. He talks to, of course, all of the Anglo leaders, and gets along quite well with many of them, and writes home, as a matter of fact, that the imprisonment of Stephen F. Austin has really not caused as much a stir as was feared in Mexico. And indeed, some of the citizens there seem to have found that Austin's actions were censorable, and therefore they weren't disturbed by his arrest at all and thought he might have deserved it. So he's sending these oddly comforting messages back from Texas as he begins his trip in the spring of 1834. It's interesting that he said, let Austin sit in jail for a while. There's not an immediate problem. Later, he perceives that it would be helpful to Mexico and to garner favor with the colonists if Austin were released, which he eventually was, on bail by the end of the year. And Almonte, according to people who were involved in helping secure Austin's release, was instrumental in recommending that Austin be released on bail in Mexico City, and because he felt at that point it would not be compromising Mexico, and it would be helpful to the situation. Almonte was authorized to essentially promise anything, to stall for time, anything that was legitimately within the power of the central government to offer or to promise to the colonists. And so he did. And so when things got sticky later on, he was roundly criticized as having been duplicitous and just speaking through one side of his mouth and that all sort of thing. But he was literally there to assess the situation and to calm the situation, because one of the first things he finds out is that there are no soldiers up here. There is no respect for civil authority. And we've already heard that it was already a mindset, a predisposition not to respect authority figures. Well, there was already a tenuous enough administration there to begin with, and then when the authority is disrespected and they have enough numbers to make it stick, there was an intolerable situation. Almonte kept running into this and sending home complaints to the Mexican government about it. Said, there will be no respect here until we have some means of enforcing our authority. I'm sort of anticipating the report that he writes, and I think I'll proceed right now to examine the secret report, which is the sort of the centerpiece of the book that Jack and I have just done, because in it he sums up all of his experiences as well as his attitudes about what he was finding in Texas at this time. And first of all, he was looking at the situation of agitators and troublemakers. He was trying to identify who they were, where they were, how many they were, what kind of resources they had available to them, and what were the best means of defending against them should they ever decide to act overtly and openly in open rebellion, which they, of course, they eventually did. He also looked at fiscal measures that were needed. We've already seen that there was armed conflict when there was an attempt to establish custom houses and things like this to collect customs in Texas from people who were accustomed not to paying these taxes and these fees. They'd become used to being treated so generously that when they finally did try to decide to establish fees, they were highly resistant to it. But also he surveyed the natural resources and the population and all of these other factors that would go into establishing a coherent, rational Mexican policy toward Texas. I should back up and say that the reason all of this had gotten so out of hand was that all during this period, the 1830s, particularly after 1832, Mexico was embroiled in internal conflict in the interior states, and they really could not pay that much attention to Texas. This was the problem. After 1832, with these conflicts at Anahuac and Fort Velasco, there were hardly any troops left in Texas. About 100, they said, at the garrison in Bejar, and nothing else anywhere. Nacogdoches, nothing. No troops in the area of the border with the United States, the expanding United States. No troops there. said, how can we expect to be respected? How can we enforce the laws that we have on our own books? How can we enforce any of the features of competent and coherent administration if we have no means of enforcing it? So this was the one big overriding view that he was expressing in this report. To summarize the suggestions in the report, he was saying, first of all, we need just a few troops, cavalry and infantry, just to get up here, to establish a presence somewhere. But ultimately, he was saying we need about 3,000 troops. This is the part of the secret report that was never made public. There was a statistical part of it that was actually published in Mexico, and a lot of people have looked at that, and in fact, some historians, since many decades back, thought that was the secret report, the statistical report that was an extract from it. That is not. The part that was held back from the public are these strategic considerations. And these strategic considerations, first of all, 3,000 troops, he suggested, be sent to Texas. Behar, Goliad, down on the coast to enforce customs law, to stop smuggling, the importing of slaves from Cuba. We mentioned Fanon was one of the people involved in that. And a presence along the northern borders, the northeastern borders of the United States, with the United States, because the United States was already de facto encroaching across the borders and establishing taxation and trial in courts and things in what they claimed to be Mexican territory, coming in from Arkansas territory, and just sort of bleeding in slowly with a U.S. Presence there. So he said the only way to inspire respect for Mexican sovereignty here is to have troops in the area, but we have none. So all of these, also the migration of Indians. This was another sore point with the United States, with the Jackson administration. Not only did Almonte, and by extension the Mexican government, feel that the Jackson administration was promoting all sorts of conniving attempts to acquire Texas from Mexico. That was the underlying understanding of the Mexican government. But they were also forcing all of the so-called 5 civilized tribes from the southeastern United States into Indian territory and forcing them into Mexican territory. Indeed, there were many of these tribes established around Nacogdoches wanting land and wanting to settle in Texas. Remember Almonte's own background. He had a sympathy, an inherent sympathy with persons of color or persons of mixed color, or however you want to describe it at the time. He was extending open arms in his own dealings with mestizos, mulattoes, and all other people, as they quoted his instructions, despised in the United States of the North. They were wanting to extend open arms to these people to come and settle in Mexico. They were almost inviting slaves. In fact, his instructions, the first version of his instructions said, we will, a slave by the act of stepping on Mexican soil has become free, and has become free even of the 90-year contracts that they have supposedly signed as a means of stepping around the slavery issue. He said, step on Mexican territory, you're a free person, and you can settle in Mexico and be a citizen. There are all sorts of embracing of peoples who were being mistreated by the Anglo-American expansion. He was wanting to offer them refuge in Mexico. But this was for the Indians that were already there. And he was worried about more Indians being pushed out by the expanding Anglo-Americans in the United States and being pushed into Mexico and becoming a huge problem for Mexico. I want to read a couple of quotes here of some of his statements before we finally end up going to war. Let me see on the Indians. This is very interesting. He said, these Indians, the ones who are now already on our territory, are the natural enemies of the Anglo-Americans. In the depth of their souls, they feel resentment for the dispossession they have suffered. Were these Indians given the lands that were promised to them 7 or 8 years ago, I believe the government could rely on them at any time. And here's this phrase, they can bring together 500 men, all armed with American carbines that they call rifles. Now, that's why this stuff was not made public. Anglo-Americans read this stuff in Texas, they would have really gone off the deep end. But if I believe that we should avail ourselves of the tribes that are already in our territory, I do not favor admitting more. I will add, however, that if I were asked which would be better, to admit friendly Indians or Anglo-Americans, I would say Indians. This also would not have gone down well with me. The reason is simple. The Indians are more loyal to us and less fearsome than the Americans, should the case arise, because although they are valiant, they cannot yet combine their movements. Besides that, they do not understand intrigue to the degree that the North Americans do. So he'd been dealing with them. Yeah, this was not theory for him. At the same time, as a translator, you have to deal with phrases like indio bárbaro, indios bárbaros, and other phraseology of the time. And of course, an era of political correctness, editors cringe at translations like savage Indians and barbarians and so on and so forth. But this is the terminology of the time. These are the attitudes of the time. And so the Comanches and the Lipan Apaches are indios bárbaros, and they're a problem, and they must be attacked and either wiped out or pushed away from settlement. Therefore, the real people that he wants to come and settle in Texas in the future, i.e. Mexicans from the interior, not Europeans, not Indians, no more Anglo-Americans, but Mexicans from the interior, he says, until we launch these punitive strikes against the Comanches and the Lipan Apaches and the other marauding Indians, we'll never be able to develop Mexico along the lines that we are hoping. Now, there are many other features. He wanted to move the capital from Saltillo or Monclova, whichever. They had been fighting over the location of the capital there. They wanted to move the capital to Béjar, San Antonio de Béjar. That would totally alienate the people in Coahuila. I mean, you know that. But his idea was a strategic one, that San Antonio de Béjar was near the center of the action. It was not far from the coast. It was not far from Nacogdoches and American Louisiana and Arkansas territory. It was where the center of political action needed to be. Also a center of culture and of commerce. He was wanting to open ports and stimulate trade through the ports of El Copano, for example, and others across into Chihuahua and across that northern part of Mexico. These were all wonderful ideas and all sorts of visions of what Texas could be if we managed to suppress the troublemakers and put troops in here to protect our interest and inspire respect for our institutions. And stimulate the economy, and so on and so forth. You see all these wonderful things. Bilingual education. He is an advocate of bilingual education. All sorts of things in his, and of course he wanted to be the commissioner overseeing all of this ultimately. He said you need someone who knows the language, who knows the North American mind, and who's experienced on the ground with all that's going on. And I think I am that person. It never happened. By the end of his commission, at the end of 1834, he submits his secret report. He's sent to Washington as a member of a diplomatic mission discussing the boundary conflicts with the American government. And all the time that he's in Washington, the situation is deteriorating on the ground in Texas, such that by 1835, October of 1835, and here comes the title of our talk finally, he writes this letter from New York City, October 1835. I guess we've already had Goliad has already undertaken. So the armed conflict is underway. He says, Gonzales, I mean not Goliad, the Gonzales. The newspapers that I am sending you separately will inform you of recent events in Texas. The audacity of those colonists is now intolerable, as is the protection given them by the authorities in New Orleans and other places he mentioned. It is necessary for the government to assume all the vigor sufficient to repress the excesses of these adventurers and to severely criticize this U.S. government, whose treacherous conduct I am confirming more each day. If it were declared, or we discovered beyond a doubt, that President Jackson is secretly protecting the revolution in Texas, we would have more than enough means to defeat it, seeking support in France and other places he mentioned. And here's the phrase that really would have caused an impact, and causing the uprising of the 2 million slaves and the 300 or 400,000 Indians whose land they have taken. What we would need is money, and I'm sure that for this war, we would find it soon. Far from believing that we should avoid this encounter with the United States, I say we should seek it. On the sea, we fear nothing because we have nothing to lose. On land, we are equal, if not superior. We just need activity, and I believe that we will have enough to salvage our honor and preserve our status as an independent nation to which we have risen by our own efforts. So you can see him as he's writing these lines. He's snapped. He's broken. All of his optimism that he's been reflecting in his letters and finally in his secret report about what could be done in Texas is now down the tubes, and things have gotten beyond the focus of his secret report and his plan for Texas. Things are beginning to take this downslide. And so he's now casting off his diplomatic garb, he's strapping on his saber and getting ready to come to Texas with a conquering army under Santa Anna. And here's where things get really very, very interesting, because Almonte was the person involved in the planning of this campaign who had the most immediate and detailed knowledge and familiarity with Texas on the ground from having been there for 9 months recently, traveling everywhere. Although the documentation of his own immediate input into plans is not there, and it's not in our book, it's obvious that he was a close personal advisor and confidant to Santa Anna in the preparation of this campaign. We might use as an object of discussion here later, we might talk about his role in the specifics of the no quarter policy. Was this just Santa Anna, or how much of this was this Almonte? Because he agreed with the basic definition that the leaders of the insurrection in Texas should be classified as pirates. Pirates are not combatants in the formal military sense. They are not representatives of a recognized government. Therefore, they do not have the status of combatants and prisoners of war, and therefore they should be treated like other pirates would be treated. That was the essence of the no quarter policy and the rationale for the no quarter policy. Almonte's role in formulating that policy is an interesting question, which it's hard to document. Nonetheless, we know that he came with Santa Anna on the Texas expedition, was with him at the Alamo. In fact, his recommendation that they come to San Antonio as opposed to come up in the midst of the other colonies and attack them in the heart of the Anglo colonies, it was his suggestion to go to San Antonio. It was largely his urging that that should be the route taken. He was at the Alamo. Unfortunately, has nothing to say in specific about how did Davy die, but he did have a journal. And he kept a journal from the trip up from Mexico all the way through the Alamo and then eastward toward San Jacinto. And the entries become more and more terse and shorter, and finally he's just making scribbled notes in the last few days, and then there's no entry for several days before the battle here at San Jacinto. The thing is, in the battle, his journal ended up on the ground somewhere. I forget the exact location. And it was picked up off the battlefield by none other than Anson Jones. Jack, we were speculating the other day about who might have sent that journal to New York City. I went back and looked at our book again. George Childress, apparently, was the contact who knew the editor of the New York Herald, which was a fledgling paper at that time in New York, James Gordon Bennett, the editor. And he was a firebrand supporter of the Texas Revolution, and so he was only too glad to get this journal from Almonte. I don't know who he got to translate it. I'm very curious as to who the translator was, but he published it in installments in the New York Herald, in translation, in New York City. And then supposedly the journal was sent on to Andrew Jackson for his personal inspection, but then the mystery is, where is it now? Because there's no trace of this journal after this. So here's a personal memento of Almonte from the battlefield at San Jacinto, and it's lost.
It only exists in this translation, but strangely enough, nobody has challenged it as a forgery.
We have a friend that might.
Published in the summer of 1836, it would be a pretty early forgery, wouldn't it? It is generally regarded as one of the most accurate accounts of the campaign from the Mexican side.
I want to now bring this story specifically to the battlefield. We've got the journal there on the battlefield. But Almonte's role in this battle is very significant because I think it brings back all of the traits that we saw in his youthful upbringing under his father Morelos on the battlefields against the Spanish in the War of Independence. When the Texans attack and surprise the Mexican camp, a rout begins, obviously, and the Mexican troops are retreating in disorder. They're fleeing. It's not even a retreat. It's a disordered, a panic fleeing. Units are not resisting. They're not defending themselves. They're just getting away. And of course, they're getting mired in the swamps and in the drowning in the water and so on and so forth. And a huge slaughter begins to take shape. What was Almonte's role when this was going on? Almonte apparently possessed the calm and the fortitude not to panic under this situation. You know that when there's a large, uncontrolled, panicked crowd, that it takes an unusually forceful command and leadership to stop this. And it's like a herd of stampeding cattle to stop them from running over a cliff or something, to turn them away and control them. And Almonte apparently possessed this self-possession on the battlefield. His calm demeanor stopped his troops from being slaughtered one by one individually. He formed the survivors up into a large formation and orderly and began to march back in formation with himself at their head to surrender. Well, this is what saved many of them's lives, because all of a sudden the wholesale slaughter of individual stragglers became a respectful receiving of surrender of a formed up military unit with a commander at their head. Ironically, this is the funny part as well, when Almonte and this large formation of hundreds of soldiers march out of the woods with a commander at their head, Sam Houston just about lost it. He panicked because he thought this was the Mexican force coming in to reinforce, and he thought that all was lost until he realized that they had no weapons and that they were surrendering instead. So Almonte was personally responsible for saving hundreds of his own soldiers in the heat of battle. He was also probably responsible for saving Santa Anna's neck afterward, when so many wanted to string him up or shoot him or whatever for the excesses of the revolution. And his smooth diplomatic demeanor, his knowledge of English, his personal familiarity with several of the combatants there on the field, the Texian combatants, probably saved the day both for himself and for Santa Anna. He accompanied Santa Anna in his long imprisonment there and also back across the United States to Washington to meet President Jackson, his old nemesis, and then finally back to Mexico. So in other words, Almonte, of course, he's probably no revelation. He's that other officer that is seen standing in the huddle picture with Santa Anna, the only other senior officer who could obviously serve as an interpreter, and he's obviously performing that function in that painting. He's an enigmatic figure. Why did he remain loyal to Santa Anna even after the disaster there, even after the disaster of the Mexican War years later? He still remained loyal to Santa Anna. Why? And you have to go back to the mindset of Juan Nepomuceno Almonte, who from the outset of his life, his destiny was inextricably entwined with that of Mexico's nascent nationalism. And he saw Santa Anna, this strong figure on horseback, as the only hope for the chaos that he thought would otherwise ensue if they attempted the federalist form of government. And so that was his rationale for it. It's hard for us to sympathize with that view, given the character of Santa Anna. It's hard for us to sympathize with his siding with the monarchist years later against Benito Juarez and the liberal republic and all that in the 1860s. Yet that's his rationale. That's what propelled him, and it was a trait that he inherited from his own father. So he's a traitor in Mexico, he's a traitor in Texas, but I think you'll find him fascinating reading in the book. So thank you very much for this ability to talk to you today.
As we move towards our question and answer session, let me remind you that our microphone is placed in the center of the room. And as you formulate your questions and begin to work your way towards the microphone, let me do my best to intimidate you by reminding you of who you're asking questions to up here. Greg Cantrell, whom I've accused of not being able to hold a job, has taught at Sam Houston State and Hardin-Simmons University and University of North Texas, and now holds the Irma and Ralph Lowe Chair in Texas History at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, which is a roughly equivalent, as I've told him, to being guru of Texas history. Andres Tijerina has taught at a number of universities also, UT Austin, UT San Antonio, Kingsville, Texas A&M, and is now professor of history at Austin Community College. The job that John Wheat has held since 1978 is official archives translator at University of Texas Center for American History, formerly of another name, which is no longer mentioned. And Jack Jackson is one hell of a cartoonist. I've heard a few people say that some people slip into a cartoon or comic strip version of Texas history. You know, they're comic books and they're comic books. And one of the best biographies of Juan Seguin that exists is Los Tejanos, the comic strip version of that life by Jack Jackson. And a number of other of his books have been mentioned during this time. I know when Andreas makes fun of this comic book history of Texas history, he's talking about the old history movies. He's talking about Texas history movies. Yeah, the little booklet that was used in the public school system back in when, 1928? Ooh, our ethnic humor, idea of ethnic humor was quite dramatically different back in those days. But I, strangely enough, was inspired by that. And I felt like that if you kicked it up to the next level, if you really did your research and tried to document exactly how this all happened, you could actually use this medium, lowly medium, as a very effective teaching tool, especially younger readers to Texas history. So I've cranked out 5 of these things, and I kind of grit my teeth a little bit when Andres uses comic book history in such demeaning fashion, because some people still today, as I think one of the guys that emailed you said, I've forgotten all the other books that I used in junior high, but I can still remember illustrations from that little comic book and what the guys were saying. Caramba, this guy's kicking a cat, you know. So I'm quite proud of the illustrated work that I've done. Larry McMurtry said that a whole two generations of students in Texas were stopped dead in their tracks by Texas history movies. It got their attention. And when you're dealing with students in junior high schools, just getting their attention is a major accomplishment. Well, a year ago at the Houston Club, we had a very contentious and lively audience who rose up, if not in arms, at least in a dither, and asked us a number of questions, and I don't see anyone having made their way to the microphone yet. So if you assume that there would be a long line, here we go. There are some folks now. Yes, sir. Please begin.
Let's not forget about some of the other soldiers that were in the Alamo garrison that fought at San Jacinto. There was Joel Robinson, who left the Alamo the evening of March the 5th, a teenager, as a courier. He was the last courier out of the Alamo. He joined up eventually with Houston, fought at San Jacinto, was present at the party that captured Santa Ana, and Santa Ana made the last part of his journey back into the Texan camp on the back of Joel Robinson's horse. Also, there was John Walker Baylor, who was not only in the Alamo garrison, he participated in the siege and storming of Bayard, served in the Alamo garrison, left the Alamo as a courier, joined up with a cavalry company of Albert C. Horton, was present at the Battle of Coleto, fought with Sam Houston at San Jacinto, received a slight wound thought to be insignificant, was discharged from the Army, took a visit to Alabama visiting his uncle. This wound became septic and he died. According to Stephen Hardin, John Walker Baylor was the only soldier known be present or participate in all the 4 major battles of the Texas Revolution. Thank you. And I don't want to take anything away from Juan Seguin.
No, I concede to Steve Harden.
Yes, sir.
Did I? Yes, you said that.
Yes, sir.
I have one observation and then a question. I was interested in Almonte's recommendation that Bayard become the capital of Texas, and his reasons for it, central location, near the action and all that. It sounded just like Toyota read his work before they decided that. The next thing I'm going to dodge when I ask, Jack, would you translate San Jacinto into English?
Do what?
Translate San Jacinto into English.
Well, this idea, of course, about moving the government, state government of Coahuila and Texas up to San Antonio was one way to try to eliminate the squabbles that were going on between Saltillo and Monclova. They were basically, the government was in total disarray at that point. All the liberals were in Monclova, and all the centralists were in Saltillo, and they were going at it and declaring that neither one of them was a legitimate body. And so Almonte had the bright idea, well, if we can just shift it up to Texas, they'll shut up down there about that. In reality, they would have probably joined together to fight the idea of losing the capital because, you know, then as now, you got a capital, you got a lot of money coming in and so on and so forth. But anyway, it was a pretty dramatic suggestion of the day, and poor people in Texas for generations had been trying to get the seat of government moved from places like, you know, Monterey or Saltillo. They surely would have applauded that. But, you know, he's trying to keep an idea, an eye on the Anglo troublemakers. And what better way to do it than to have a commandant, you know, located right there in Texas.
If I'm not mistaken, for very different reasons, Governor Augustin Viesca, right as the revolution was beginning, was also suggesting moving the capital, moving the revolutionary capital of Federalist Coahuila y Tejas up to Bayer.
Yes,
About this a little bit later, and for very different reasons.
Yeah, he was fleeing. You talking
What about
the
St.
governor?
Hyacinth, though, Jack?
I don't know about that one. John?
John's the translator.
Well, yeah, right, you're just asking about St. Hyacinth,
Yes.
the actual English version of that?
I would like to know a little bit about it. We all know San Jacinto. We study it. We've lived with it forever. And St. Hyacinth, I'd like to know a little bit about that. Why? What?
It was already a pre-existing name, so I don't know the the rationale for naming that particular river. If, maybe some of the folks here do.
You know, they were, a lot of water hyacinths were growing in the San Jacinto River along Buffalo Bayou. So they got the name from water hyacinth.
But why is it called St. Hyacinth?
I think there was also a Catholic saint.
I think
And I think that the actual there are two theories about the origins. One is that the water flower literally, and the other is that the Catholic saint. And I'm not enough of a Catholic being a Baptist to know who Saint Hyacinth was.
Polish.
A saint of Polish origin. We know more than we did before then.
all I will tell you, and I go no further than this, is if you can find a reference book that gives you a list of patron saints and what they are the patron saints of, you ought to look up St. Hyacinth.
Catholic Encyclopedia is one.
You may also wish to consider on what that saint's day is, who named the river, and did they go past it at about that time?
Sure. Yes, sir.
You stated that Almonte's journal was getting terser and shorter statements. Do you have a supposition as to why that is?
Why were the
were they
entries
getting shorter
becoming
and terser?
shorter and shorter as they approached San Jacinto?
Well, things are going pretty wild and woolly at that point. What happens is once Santa Anna realizes that the rebel government is trying to flee to Galveston Bay, he decides to rush ahead and capture them. If you can capture the rebel government, and Sam Houston's army's already fleeing, he thinks, to Louisiana by way of Nacogdoches with everybody else on the runaway scrape. This was a bold plan. If you could capture the rebel government, basically the revolution is over. And his name would be in headlines back in Mexico City instead of Urrea's, who had been having most of the battlefield victories at this point. So there was an attempt to do that, and unfortunately it just didn't work out. Almonte, once they got to Harrisburg and realized that they had missed them and they had gone on to this tiny settlement of New Washington, which is Colonel James Morgan had a big fancy hotel that Emily West was the custodian for, or the lady in residence, kind of managing that for him.
She was a housekeeper and cook.
Okay, so Almonte is sent ahead with 50 dragoons to try to catch them before they can escape down there, and this is why his notes trail off. I mean, this is real hectic days. He's in the saddle. And so this is kind of why his journal tapers off. But we do have several other people that kept diaries right to the end there. Pedro Delgado kept one. Gabriel Nunez kept one. Santa Anna's secretary, Martinez Caro. So there are 2 or 3 other accounts given by Mexican officers that kind of fill in the blank there of Almonte's just kind of tapering off. And they said there's a date given and there was just something in pencil with nothing there. So he's on the move, and I don't really think he had time to settle down and make nightly entries or whatever at that point.
One of the most interesting things that Almonte did is he was galloping up to the shore of Galveston Bay and saw that group of Texas politicians fleeing in a rowboat out to the ship that would take them to Galveston, is that he stopped his soldiers from shooting President Burnett's boat, because Mrs. Burnett and perhaps other women were present on the boat. And as some historians have said, the gallant Almonte said, okay, this is against the rules. So he may have been, Jack, pretty vicious in his rules towards mercenaries, but he wouldn't let them shoot, even though that was the president of Texas and his cabinet on the boat going out to the ship.
Well, it's also pretty clear that he was mainly responsible for the release of Susanna Dickinson and the Babe of the Alamo, too. I think that he influenced Santa Anna. We say that for years we said that we had no messenger of defeat at the Alamo, but in fact, she was the messenger of defeat. And when she reached Gonzales with news of how that there had been no survivors during the attack, that's when the runaway scrape really cranked into high gear. I mean, you know, people were screaming and yelling and trying to get out of town as quickly as possible. But Almonte was instrumental in helping her. He gave her a horse to ride to get to Gonzales after the battle took place. So I really consider him a very humane individual. Women and children were not fair game during this conflict, and consider him a very honorable officer.
There is one more little piece of information when he was writing longer entries, and that is they knew exactly where Houston was. In Almonte's campaign journal, he says, we've got informants who tell us that Houston is up there at Jared Gross's plantation. And rather than pursue him, they just figured he's on the run. We'll just go after better game, those politicians. But it's not that Houston had hidden from them. The Mexican high command knew where he was and decided to ignore him. Yes, Elizabeth.
Well, first of all, about the name San Jacinto, San Jacinto, and Saint Hyacinth. When I was working there for the museum, I did a little study of this, and I found out that the saint was from Eastern Europe during sometime in the Middle Ages. Therefore, he got into the calendar of the Roman Church. There's very little known about him, apparently. As for water hyacinths, I can't tell you offhand, I haven't thought about it in a while, but I believe that the plant was actually an import. It is not a native. And so it would not have been there when the early Spanish came through and probably named that river, as we'll suggest, probably close to St. Hyacinth Day, which is in August. The question that I have for Professor Tejerina is this. In this really fine book that he has also written, The Tejano Empire, which really explains how Texas was settled early, you make a comment, and I quote it as a simpatico comment. I would just like your further explanation of this. During the Texas Revolution, most Tejanos had joined the opposition to the centralist Mexican government of General Santa Anna. Most Tejanos. And a student of Texas history that I am, I must say, I was surprised to realize that you might be able to say most, and I'd just like for you to speak with us about that.
I think Paul Lack probably is the authority that I see in terms of the Tejanos. Paul has done extensive research on the actual numbers of Anglo-Texans and Mexican Texans. Actually, I would say probably that even those who were in support of Santa Anna were weakly in support of him. And that figure then falls off very rapidly. You know, Jack was talking about the runaway scrape. Tejanos also had a runaway scrape. And that figure dries up very rapidly when Santa Anna does enter Texas, because while there were in the government at the state level and also in the ayuntamiento level, that is the city level, the municipality level, were a lot of Tejanos who supported the centralist government. There, of course, were a lot of them who did not, but that support fell off very rapidly once Santa Anna began to march into Texas, because he took out a retribution against all Tejanos, and then they all started fleeing, and they fled. And again, this is another point that I've always made, that we talk about the Anglo-American runaway scrape. Very few people talk about the Tejano runaway scrape. So to answer your question, that figure is an early figure. The fact that there were most of them, that's before Santa Anna arrives. Once Santa Anna began to mete out a retribution against all Tejanos, then that figure dries up very rapidly, and it's reduced. Most Tejanos don't support either. Really, after Santa Anna arrives, they don't support either Anglos or Mexicans. They run off. They abandon their cities. They abandon San Antonio. They abandon Nacogdoches. They abandon Goliad. And those who did not abandon, especially around the Goliad area, were driven out. Those who did not abandon Santa Anna, San Antonio de Béjar, were driven out by San Antonio's army. Those who did not abandon Goliad and Victoria were driven out by the Anglo-Texas army. Philip Dimmitt, Fannin had a sort of a scorched earth policy with regard to the Tejanos. And incidentally, we have some of those Tejano descendants of some of those Tejano families here in this room today whose families were driven out by the, and this is the truth, the Anglo-Texan army drove their families out of their homes around the Victoria-Goliad area, and then when the Anglo-Texas army left, the Mexican army came in and whipped the Tejanos, the Tejano mayor, and drove the Tejanos off. And then when the Mexican army left, the Anglo army came back and whipped the same Goliad mayor, Tejano mayor, for conspiring with the enemy. And so either way, Tejanos fled. So I'll make that statement for before Santa Anna's arrival, but after that, Tejano population really dwindles off into the hinterland.
It's worth noting also that while the numbers are small, there are Anglo opponents to the revolutionary movement also. Many of you who know about this battle know that a nearby high spot to the battlefield was known as Tory Hill. And the work of both Paul Eck and the late Margaret Henson have explored the issue of Anglo-tourism. Again, not large numbers, but enough that you can write about them.
One of the things that Paul Eck points out in his book is that most Anglo men and most Tejano men were on the run during the Texas Revolution. Just use simple math and count up those guys who were in the battles, and you can see that that's true. I think Greg did mention in his biography of Stephen F. Austin that the impresario counted 135 Tejanos among those who were in his so-called Army of the People besieging San Antonio in 1835. 135 soldiers is quite a few people from a town of that small size. And of course, one other thing which should be mentioned is that this outbreak of fighting began as a centralist federalist war, not a war of secession, not a war of independence. And the Tejanos had been fairly staunch federalists for a long time because of that desire for autonomy and states' rights and driving their own interest and governing their own interest that Andres talked about before. So to find them opposed to centralism would not be a surprise. I think Jack and John in their book mentioned a document signed by the alcalde Juan Seguin, or he might have been jefe politico at the time, I forget, but in 1834, Seguin and I think 46 leading citizens of San Antonio signed a document calling for Texas to organize itself as a government separate from that of Coahuila, which, if you'll recall, is what Stephen F. Austin said that got him thrown into solitary confinement. So there's a good bit of autonomy support and federalist support. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I have a couple subjects I'd like to address. One of them is the impact of the New Orleans bankers and the New Orleans Grays, professional military unit, on the progress of the Texas Revolution. I used to have a friend that was the curator of Fort Bend Historical County Museum, and we jointly bought some surplus documents that were the Texian loan. And that document was signed by William H. Wharton, Branch T. Archer, and Stephen F. Austin as agents for Texas. And it was in section-size lots written in Pokeberry ink. And basically it provided the provisional government of the Republic of Texas with gold at the rate of 50 cents an acre, which largely provided funding, I believe. If any of you have any knowledge, I'd like to know about it. And how that impacted it and what was the relationship between those financial institutions in New Orleans and the sending of the New Orleans Grays to Texas and the impact that had, and how the Texas representatives wound up getting their favorable support. The second thing I was interested in, since I'm past president of the Houston Light Guard Veterans Association, is how the Lynchburg and the Harrisburg guards, after Santa Anna had destroyed both of those communities and they had fought in the Battle of San Jacinto, some of the survivors came into Houston and ultimately were part of the founding of the Houston Light Guard militia unit, which continues today in the Texas National Guard as an active unit. And if you know of anything along those lines, I'd like to hear about it. And I'd also invite consideration for these two topics being more detailed in discussion at another one of the symposiums.
Anybody want to tackle that one?
Hasn't somebody recently published a book on these New Orleans Grays?
Yes, there was a book on that.
Gary Brown is the author of that.
Just wondering if it had any new information in it for you.
Well, the reason I brought that up was because I wasn't sure if there's any new information, and since y'all do research, perhaps you might have run into it.
Let me try to tackle a couple of those, unless one of my colleagues wants to do that, because I've been dealing with a New Orleans Gray for about 12 years, and my publishers are getting really impatient. His name was Hermann Ehrenberg, and he wrote the longest and most vivid account of any soldier in the Texas Army. Unfortunately, he wrote it auf Deutsch, in Leipzig. And it has yet to have a reliable English translation, although there are some both full and partial English translations out. Remember, the New Orleans Greys left early enough for Ehrenberg and for both units of the New Orleans Greys to get to San Antonio before the siege, before the fall of Bexar. One unit arrived by sea and was there even before Stephen F. Austin gave up his command, and the second unit, which came by way of Natchitoches and Nacogdoches and down the Camino Real, got there in time to take part in the storming of Bexar between December 5th and December 10th. The notes that you were talking about, the loan documents you were talking about that would have been signed by Archer and Wharton and Austin would have been executed after the first of the year of 1836, because that's when those guys got to New Orleans, sent as diplomatic agents and also as agents to try to get money, to try to get loans. And it could be expected, I think, that Big Texas would almost certainly default in any payback in gold or any payback in specie and would have to fall back on paying it in land. That's what Texas had a lot of. So people were loaning Texas money hoping to get a, I won't use the Texas term, but a large pile of land. So in terms of your question about what's the relationship between New Orleans Greys and those particular financiers, it wouldn't have been direct, but there were a number of people who were in New Orleans outfitting the New Orleans Greys. They had rifles. One of the mistakes of an early translation of Ehrenberg was to refer to the guns they had as muskets. That's not true. Ehrenberg and the New Orleans Greys were outfitted with rifles, and they took very great pride in those rifles and looked with some contempt upon the muskets carried by the majority of the Mexicans. But they went to stores, or what in German is called Magazin. My German plurals are not that great anymore, but they were outfitted in this gray cloth. There's a whole argument about whether they were uniforms or not. I'm not going to touch that. But they were all wearing gray, and they looked kind of alike.
A lot of them were on foot, too. You would just assume these guys would ride out on horseback from New Orleans, but I gather they came up the river on steamboat or something like that.
They came up the river on a boat called the Washita.
Yeah.
Which landed in Natchitoches and let them out in Natchitoches. They marched overland until they got to Nacogdoches.
I think they were probably pretty footsore by then, because I start seeing talks about people coming up with horses and saddles and to supply these guys so they can keep going to San Antonio.
In Nacogdoches, they were outfitted as mounted men. They were provided by the citizens, many of them Tejanos, of Nacogdoches, and they also got one whale of a banquet. In Nacogdoches. And if you go there to that town now, you'll see the historic plaque, and the text of the historic plaque is taken from Ehrenberg's memoir of that huge banquet where they had bear and raccoon and all kinds of other delicacies.
I was speculating when I ran across this information that there might have been some relationship between the successful recruiting of professional military forces in Louisiana, specifically New Orleans, to kind of be a guarantee that although the Provisional Government of the Republic of Texas had a lot of land that they actually did not have control over militarily, and that was the collateral they were offering for this gold loan, that it might have been something that was either directly or indirectly, covertly, or maybe even overtly, if there's any record of it, a reason why they were promoting these military forces to come over here to protect their investment.
Although it would be a stretch to call the New Orleans Greys professionals, they were extraordinarily effective. And as Gary Brown points out in his book, they probably turned the tide. In 1835, in December of 35. Without the New Orleans Greys, it's somewhat doubtful that too many people would have followed Ben Milam and those other people who went in. The New Orleans Greys were ready to go. They didn't want to go back to their farms. They didn't have any farms. They were all fresh arrivals, and they probably were the critical strategic difference. You also mentioned the Houston Light Guard, and I won't belabor this, but one of the things that I found only a few years ago with regard to Hermann Ehrenberg is that he and a number of other unemployed Houstonians, because he did become a Houstonian in 1838 and lived here for 2 or 3 years, after he returned, after going back and forth between Texas and New Orleans immediately after the war. They organized, including some unemployed actors from the Houston Theater, they organized under the name of the Pitkin Guards. It was a frontier militia unit named after a businessman and politician in Houston by the name of Pitkin. And they were sent out to the frontier near Austin and San Antonio for 3 months in early 1843. 3 months in early 1840. And in fact, Ehrenberg himself just missed getting into the Plum Creek fight later in that year. But when they were eventually dismissed after 3 months, and Hugh McLeod, who was one of the Texan military officials, said that they were utterly worthless. They never lifted a finger, never did a darn thing, but by golly, they were citizen soldiers. And Ehrenberg went back to Germany after he became sick from dysentery during that frontier experience in 1840. He went back to Germany and wrote a book about the Texas Revolution and the Texas Republic, and he wrote it in German specifically for the Europeans because he wanted them to undergo the same kind of democratic transformation into a self-governing people that he had participated in as a volunteer in Texas in 1835 and 36.
It's no accident that when Santa Anna sent the letter to Mexico City of his victory at the Alamo, accompanying the letter was the flag of the New Orleans Volunteers. And to him, it was a smoking gun. We've been saying that the United States has not been keeping its citizens out of this rebellion. And look, we took this flag at the Alamo. There it says, New Orleans Volunteers. So that, in a sense, a lot of people in Mexico had been denying that, the United States was supposed to be a neutral country, that any kind of aid was coming. And yet here at this great battle that we all remember at the Alamo, there's their flag. Great. And we've been trying to get it back ever since, and Mexico won't give it back to us.
One other thing on your first question, the subject of the financing of the Texas Revolution is one of those subjects that's still really out there waiting for a competent scholarly book-length treatment. To my knowledge, the best source on the subject is still Eugene C. Barker's 1904 article in the Political Science Quarterly, The Finances of the Texas Revolution, for what it's worth.
I was particularly impressed with these things that you brought up, and I noticed Ann Becker's book out there that she has on the Houston Light Guard, and I was going through there, and she handed me one of her source materials, which is a list of all the ships that brought people here to Texas. And I noticed the tremendous number of Germans that were listed there, some from Ireland, some from England, some from the United States. And I thought about that as the kind of thing that would be worthy of further development also. I was just absolutely fascinated with the idea that it seems like Almonte winds up in New Orleans, and I think Santa Anna went there, and then later was up in New York after he lost everything in Mexico for a while. Seems everything leads back to New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And I think, it was a logical conclusion that they would use that as evidence that the United States actively engaged in trying to acquire or, make Texas part of the United States.
Right, just one last reminder that letter from Almonte, their audacity is now intolerable, is a long declaration of war against the United States for being behind the troubles in Texas and not strictly just against the Texans.
You don't mean an official declaration of war, but
right. But let's take it to them because look, they're the ones that are behind all of this. What it was.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Who's next, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Rudy Tejano Peña. I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas. And first of all, let me express my sincere appreciation for all the presenters. Last year, I had the pleasure of being here and bringing up the subject and the point about Tejanos not being acknowledged in Texas history. This year, I'm so proud and elated to see that one of persons that I have a lot of respect and admiration is one of your panelists. However, I'd like to point out one of the things that I have been working on very hard, and that is when we talk about Tejanos, we seem to bring up the point that they are Mexican Texans or Texan Mexicans. I'd like just to make sure that people understand that Tejanos became Tejanos back in the 1600s when Tejas was established as a province of the New Spain. The people that were born in that time, in that era, they were not Mexican. The people that fought at the Battle of Medina in 1813, they were Tejanos. Now, when we talk about Tejanos and we say they're Mexican American or Mexican Texans, and we have an audience this size, and they're going to go back home and talk about Tejanos, and they say, well, the Mexican Texans, that is just misleading and does not give credit where credit is due. And I believe that as historians, as teachers, we need to make these issues and give credit where credit is due. Mexico became Mexico in 1824, declared its independence in 1810, was able to get it in 1821, and finally established the republic in 1824. Tejanos have been here since the 1600s, 1700s. And one question I have here is, and this gets for you because you were the last one, as I wrote down, our Tejas historians continue to include accounts of Mexican incidents, which is admirable. However, Texas citizens are in desperate need of the accounts and participation of the native Tejanos' significant contributions and participations in the struggle for Texas independence. We seem to concentrate on the Mexican events, but we're not talking about the Tejanos. Their contributions.
What was your question again?
Well, this is for you. You brought up about the Mexican doing this and the Mexican doing that, and we don't talk about, other than Seguin, we don't talk about the other people that have stories. And the question is, when are we going to start talking and writing about those characters that are significant to the Tejanos rather than the Mexican community?
Well, if the question is for me, I would just remind you that when the American Revolution was fought, it was fought by Virginians and Georgians and Marylanders, many of whom said that that was their country. That's what Thomas Jefferson said about Virginia. It did not at the same time prevent him from taking on an American identity. Tejanos were here before there was a country of Mexico. That did not prevent most of them from calling themselves Mexicans. They did. It's in the documents. And so if they call themselves Mexicans, who am I to say they're not?
With all due respect, sir, they were calling themselves Mexicans because the United States citizens were calling them Mexicans. And
I'm talking about before they ever heard the United States citizens call them Mexicans. I'm talking about people who fought not only for the independence of Texas, but as the independence of New Spain as Mexico. So if the question was for me, I'll answer it. I try to be true to the documents. I try to be true to the way the people saw themselves. And they referred to themselves as Tejanos and as Mexicanos. And they did not see, until push came to shove, a difference there. And then when they had to choose, some put the primacy on Mexicanos, like the great Carlos de la Garza, and some put the primacy on Tejanos, like Juan Seguin or Jose Antonio Navarro. And to their great credit, after the war, most of them put those differences aside and stayed in Texas and continued to live, even though their side may or may not have won. You have some people standing behind you, sir.
Thank you. And I appreciate what you just said, sir. The point is that we need to have the records, set the record straight, and you owe it to us as historians. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Recently there was an excellent program on PBS about Navarro and his family and his role in the revolution and so on. And they talked about the 1813 incident where the Spanish came into San Antonio and persecuted the people who were living there. And I just was wondering, I'm not that familiar with that period in the history of of Texas, and was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit about what was going on there. This was the Spanish government, I guess, and persecuting Spanish citizens.
Sure, we've got 2 or 3 people here up on the podium who were part of that PBS special, and I must remind you that I think it's coming again on April 26th on Monday night, and the American Experience series. But Andres or Greg, both of you participated in that?
Yes, ma'am. That was one of the first major battles here in Texas after Mexico declared its independence from Spain. There had been some skirmishes before that, small battles, but that was a major battle in which a large Spanish army under a Spanish commander named Joaquin Arredondo marched up to San Antonio, and just on the outskirts of San Antonio, just a few miles south on the Medina River, engaged an army of Tejanos and defeated them. And then after the defeat, that became a rout. Pursued the defeated soldiers all the way up to some of them to Nacogdoches. And as they caught them, they literally hacked them to pieces with machetes. Some of them they caught and they beheaded them. Others were caught in the San Antonio area in Béjar and put in prisons so tightly packed that the military reports indicate that after they stuffed them, they then packed others in above them in the room who suffocated during the night. And every day after that then, for several days, Tejanos were taken out and shot, executed, 10, 15 at a time. And during that time, the city was occupied by the Spanish army, and the women and girls were put into a stockade, several hundred of them, women and girls, put into a stockade where they were forced to do services for the Spanish troops. And there are reports that the women were abused besides simply having to do service for them. Now, a couple of things that I'd like to add to that in general, that there were Anglo-Americans fighting with the Tejanos. A substantial percentage of the Tejano army was Anglo-American. That the battle continued, that Jose Antonio Navarro was there present, he saw it, that he was pursued, his family was driven out, they occupied his home in San Antonio, that Santa Anna was with Arredondo's army and had a personal vendetta against the Navarro family and against Jose Antonio Navarro, and eventually captured Jose Antonio Navarro after 1841 when, if you've ever heard of the Santa Fe expedition, when President Lamar sent an expedition of Texans up to try to capture Santa Fe as part of Texas. Navarro was one of their commissioners going there for Lamar. Navarro was captured. He was given the opportunity, the only one on the expedition given the opportunity to escape, since he was a Mexican, and said, they asked him if he was a Mexican or a Texan, and this comes back to the identity that the gentleman was asking about a while ago. Navarro said, I, sir, come from a place called Texas, where every man votes his own conscience. I don't think Navarro cared whether he was Texan, Tejano, Mexican, or what. He cared about where he came from and what he stood for, and for that he went to prison.
I might add one other thing, and I think it's illustrative of many of the themes that we've dealt with today about sort of the victors writing history, which clearly has been the case at least until recent times with regard to the Texas Revolution. The Battle of the Medina River in 1813, south of San Antonio, was the bloodiest battle ever fought on Texas soil. I bet that 99.999% of Texans would answer San Jacinto if you asked them that question. And those same people would have never heard of the Battle of the Medina River. But the fact is that nearly, I think more than double the casualties in that battle, something like 1,300 compared to the 600 and some odd at San Jacinto. And that alone tells you a lot about who has written and interpreted the history of Texas until recent times.
I have to mention, since we're on the subject, and I hope you don't mind us giving you this much information, but that did not become a rout until after they had suffered tremendous casualties. They were completely outnumbered, more than 2 to 1. The weaponry, the cannon, they were outnumbered, completely overwhelmed. When they were finally defeated in a military battle, then they began to flee. But I have to point out, there is not one historical marker at all in Texas or in San Antonio to commemorate that sacrifice for Texas independence. There is no shrine. That's not true. Well, if there is, I sure want to know about it. I want to know about it. That's why I'm standing. Okay, good. I want to hear it. I should. A lot of times I do say this, especially with a local crowd like this, because you think we're getting some picky questions here. You ought to see what it's like in South Texas talking this subject with the Mexican Americans. They're really picky about their history. And I always say it like this: if there is one, I need to know. So anyway, certainly there is no Alamo for them. Certainly there's no shrine for them.
Sorry. Before we find out this information for Andres, I would just say that having spent some time with the De La Peña diary, that the Battle of Medina and the executions of Tejanos in 1813 was very much on the mind of Santa Anna when he came back to San Antonio in 1836. De La Peña overheard someone say, yeah, we're going to be hard on these people. Remember, they hung 800. At the time of the defeat of the rebels in San Antonio back in 1813. I don't know if the figure's correct, but that was very much on their mind, and there were hundreds who were executed, I think, without a doubt, at the time. Yes, sir. Enlighten us. I'm sorry, did you have another? Okay, yes, sir. Enlighten us, please.
Well, actually, I was going to get into the other part of it first. I think the importance of the Battle of Medina has been lost to us as modern-day historians. And my wife would question my word modern there. She says I know more about the 1600s than I do the 1900s. But if you were the son of a man who was massacred in 1813, when 1,300 Anglos, Tejanos, Indians, I'd love to hear that speech too, what we told the Indians to join us, went out to fight 1,400 Spaniards, and they were annihilated. What would you have done when William Travis rode into San Antonio with about 50 men and said, y'all join me against 5,000 men, led by one of the people who had been in the Battle of Medina? That's why they closed their doors. And I think we're really losing the importance of the Battle of Medina on our own Texas Revolution. The same as we're losing our concern for the Republic of Rio Grande. It explains that it was not racism that caused the war. It was pure centralism and
when you read
the political issue of Santa Anna.
When you read about those battles, I'm sure that you're coming from where I'm coming from, because that's a feeling I've always had. It's always Anglos and Mexicans fighting together.
Right. And that's not the way it was.
Every one of those wars, every one of those battles, there are Anglos and Mexicans fighting side by side for independence, for freedom. Every one of them. And when an Anglo wants to recruit, he recruits Mexicans. When a Mexican wants to recruit because he wants something at the Tejano, and again, I defer to this gentleman who's real, specific about the term. It doesn't matter if it's Tejano or Anglo, they recruit from both sides. And people, whether they're Anglo or Tejano, join in for the cause of independence. I've always said, there's no one group that has a monopoly on independence. Independence is something Tejanos have fought for, not only in 1836, but in 1888, and on and on and on. And I don't have to remind anybody, I hope I don't have to remind anybody of the combat record that Tejanos have until World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, even Iraq today.
Well, I've gotten to know Rudy real well this last year, and I understand his point. It's the same as the Native Americans. We've beat them down so long by calling them by the wrong country's name that we've stopped their input into our history. I'm part American Indian too, and that's a joke. That's an insult to call a Native American an Indian. And Rudy feels the same way about being called a Mexican.
Thanks very much.
I wanted to tell you though, on the 18th of August last year, 100 of us put a marker at the hill on overlooking where Robert Thornhoff believes the battle took place, which was not on the Medina River, by the way. It's on the Galvin River. And I would invite all of you there this year. I hope to have a similar commemoration every year now.
Thank you. I know Bob Tonoff well, and I'm going to call him up and ask him to take me there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I've just been told that there are hands coming up. Yes?
Would you indulge me a question from here?
It'll have to be extremely quick.
Okay. Mr. Wheat, you said that Almonte later on supported the plebiscite, the Emperor Maximiliano von Habsburg. What position, if any, did he hold in the empire, and what became of him after the overthrow of the empire?
That question very quickly was what happened to Almonte after he supported the French, in essence. And to make it fast, he went to France.
Right, he had a diplomat, and he died in exile.
And I'll tell you, if you want to really find out how Davy Crockett died, go to France and find Almonte's papers. They found his body now, but they haven't found his papers. So maybe he really answered that question at some time.
We're still looking for that
I know that we said 4 o'clock was the time we were going to end. I'm going to allow the one more questioner who's standing before the microphone because we hadn't announced the end of questions. And then Jeff will bring us to a close. Originally, we thought we only had the room till 4 o'clock, but they've been nicer to us at the University of Houston, given us just a few extra minutes. Let me remind you, so I won't forget later, that as soon as we disband here, and Jeff will be the man to do that, there will be book signings being done out in the lobby. And if you've bought some books or brought some books, and you would like some of these gentlemen to sign them, they will be available to you after we finish here. Yes, sir.
My name is Rafael Enriquez, Jr. I'm a native Houstonian who had the privilege of majoring in American Studies at Baylor University. I merely wanted to encourage us not to rule out and exclude literature as an informative, resourceful source of information to shed light. I have in mind 2 great artists, Bret Harte, whose short story, The Devotion of Enriquez, does for fiction what Friedrich Remington did for Western camaraderie around campfires and the like. And last but not least, the great American Willa Cather, whose masterpiece, Song of the Lark, also celebrates friendship with respect to the protagonist embracing the culture of the Hispanic, Tejano, Latino culture.
And I can't resist mentioning, I believe the title is Ambrosio de Lentines, which may be the first novel written in Texas, but is a really interesting fictional version of what's going on in Texas.
Let's give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you. And finally, next spring, just watch your mailbox for your postcard. So you'll be informed of the San Jacinto events for next spring. Thank you very much for coming, and with this we will adjourn our 2004 Battle of San Jacinto Symposium.
Okay. You just want an autograph on them, or do you want them personalized? Okay.